Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Heines. Now, today we have an amazing guest. We have V.G. Anderson. She is not only a best-selling author, she is also an editor, so she can help you get your books published the right way. So before we bring out V.G. or Vanessa, we just want to remind you that we are a commercial-free enterprise here at Books in Hindsight, but we do have some great news. We've got a new logo because we're a new outfit, and we have some great-looking t-shirts made out of high-quality cotton and polyester. We have men's and women's styles in black, and we have different kind of styles from our signature line all the way to podcast guest, producer, and of course, born to read. So this just adds to the ways that you can support Books in Hindsight and the authors that we have on our program. And we do that by having their links in our comment section as well as on Books in Hindsight, where if you look at the guest author page, you will see affiliate links to our author's books. So go ahead and pick up one or two, or go ahead and pick up one of my great books, which are available at heinessight.com. Now, the last way you can sponsor this amazing podcast and our other channels is you can just go to patreon.com/hindsight and make a contribution every month of $3, $5, or $10 and get that coveted lieutenant, captain, or colonel rank that you've always desired. All right, so we've got all that out of the way. Now let's bring out V.G. Anderson, best-selling author. Let's go to the phones.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. Unfortunately, I have some very, very bad news. For some reason or other, our scheduled author could not make it today. But that's okay, because all we can do is be hopeful that she is okay. From what I understand, her and her husband are traveling, and we just hope that this bad weather and all the things that have been happening this winter, this is February of 2019, we can only hope and pray that they're safe out there and that we'll be able to get Vanessa back on the podcast. Now, this actually presents an opportunity for me to start talking to you about a project that I would like to undertake, and what better time to get this information out than right now. Now, I listen like late at night, you know how you can't sleep, so you listen to Coast AM, and you listen to these different stories and accounts. And so I just have been interested in it. For example, I never really believed in like Bigfoot. I thought, oh yeah, that's just a funny story. But you know, having always been interested in extraterrestrials and aliens, I kind of just started, having heard all the stories there. I switched over to like David Paulides' 411 books and how he talks about these missing people. And so that leads into these theories about Bigfoot and the supernatural, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest, which is a center for UFO activity, according to certain people. And it's also a center for Bigfoot activity, which it's probably more famous for. Now, I grew up here, and I have lived here a good, I guess I'd say majority of my life. I lived here about half of my life. And I I do a lot of camping. I'm out I have a boat. I'm outdoors every summer as much as I can get out. I'm an avid hiker, biker. At least I used to be. Used to ski, and I've ridden at least 500 or 600 miles just on the trails around here, and that doesn't count Alaska, where I lived for 5 years. So I have a lot of experience outside, and I can tell you right now, with the exception of seeing some of these lights in the sky that you don't really know what they are because they're not really aircraft, and they're moving either too slow or too quickly to be anything that we know of or that I would know of. There are things that I've seen, but I can't say that that's anything out of the ordinary. So in all of my time here, my experiences with the paranormal and Bigfoot has been very, very limited. But I do have a couple of experiences that I would like to talk about. And I'm just going to tell you these stories because what I would like to do, if you like this kind of thing, is I would like to actually get people's stories. If you could just send them to me, and you can send them to me at greatbooks@heinessight.com, I would actually like to compile a book of people's stories from the Northwest. And so in that spirit, and to show you kind of what I'm looking for, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that are mine, and then one of mine, or one of the stories, is not is not from me. It's a story that I heard secondhand, but the sources were very credible, and it's a story that actually has been circulating around the western end of the Olympic Peninsula for many, many years. So that's what I would like to encourage people to do then, is to think about any story you have, paranormal, preferably a first-hand account, and preferably something where you had witnesses or some account was written up where it can be, secondarily verified. Those are the kinds of stories that I'm really looking for. So if you have anything like that, and I will put your name as the author of the story, go ahead and contact me at greatbooks@heinessight.com. So without further ado, let's go into our first story. The first story is called The Lake Ozette Ghost. Now, when I was studying at Peninsula College, which was at the time Peninsula Community College in Port Angeles, there were two very attractive young ladies, and one was named Angela and one was named Michaela. And if you ever happen to hear this podcast, then hello, and thank you for contributing this story to our podcast. But according to Angela and Michaela, they lived out in the area of Lake Ozette, which is on the very western end of Washington State. It's basically the very western edge of the continental United States. Now, Lake Ozette has a town because it's next to the ocean, and before Seattle and all of that place was built, all those places were built back in the 1800s. It was easier to offload on the coast. So Lake Ozette actually became a fairly thriving town. It had a store. It had a number of people living there, working in commerce and working in the shipping industry. And it was such a big town, it had a newspaper as well as an orchestra. So as time went on, Lake Ozette thrived and then it died, like many towns that were not along the railroad or along the shipping routes to Seattle. So later on, it would have been 50, 60, 70 years later. According to Michaela and Angela, they were out in Lake Ozette. Excuse me. And they started to hear the sound of a flute playing. And it started to freak them out. So they said, well, let's go find the guy who's playing the flute. So they walked through the very thick forest, and it's very thick, it's very wet, and the sound of a flute, if it's not raining, is going to carry a long way. So they began searching and searching for the flute, and they couldn't find it. And then they went back to the site where the old Lake Ozette store used to be. And they looked up, and at the top of the building, they saw a man standing there playing a flute. And so, according to the story, they took a picture of the man. And this is back in the days when you had to get your picture developed on, at the photo mat or whatever. So they took a picture of the man and didn't think anything of it and said, okay, well, mystery solved. So after they got the picture developed, they showed... They started talking to people about this man they saw playing the flute. And some older people began to hear the story, and they pulled out a newspaper from back in the day. And they showed the picture on the front of the paper was the basically same picture the girls had taken, and the man was standing on the second floor on a balcony, and he was playing a flute. And they asked, well, who is that man? And they said, well, he's the flute player for the symphony or the orchestra, and he was the postmaster for the town. And they said, well, where is he now? And they said, well, he died back in the 1920s. So the girls were left a little bit concerned. The next story I have is called The Lady of the Lake. Now, there is a very deep lake on the Olympic Peninsula. It's called Lake Crescent. And according to the stories, the bottom of the lake has never been found. It is that deep. Now, it's not a very big lake as lakes go. It's about 5-6 miles long, and it is not exactly a long-shaped lake. It has a certain arm. Now, according to the story, one of the early settlers back in the 1800s, he got angry at his wife, and so he didn't want to get charged with murder. And he knew that if her body was not found, then he couldn't be charged. So what he did was he killed her, and he threw her body into Lake Crescent, knowing that nobody would ever be able to find her body. Well, this worked for a few years, and then people began reporting seeing a lady, in fact, the very same lady, down at the lake. And they would see her walking on the lake. Sometimes they'd see her walking on the shore. And so people began to wonder at this man's story when he said that his wife had returned back east. And so they began to suspect him. and they began to search the lake. Well, while they were searching the lake, it just so happens that the ropes and the things that were binding this woman to the rocks that held her body at the bottom of this seemingly bottomless lake broke. And at the time they were searching for her, she sprang to the surface, and the man was charged with murder. Now, the next story I'm going to tell you did not happen in Washington State. In fact, it happened in North Carolina. It happened in Fort Bragg, and it happened to me. Now, I grew up here in Washington State, and I am an outdoor person. I've always liked being outdoors, and I've always felt very comfortable being outdoors. Otherwise, I would not have joined the Special Forces as well as the 82nd Airborne Division. So it happened one night, which we often were doing at nights on Fort Bragg. We were out on maneuvers. My platoon was patrolling a particular area, and at a certain time that night, we were going to cross this dirt road. And so I was detailed to go out as security to make sure nobody came and set up like an ambush. And I was just supposed to not only provide security for the platoon, but I was also supposed to be a guide to show them the way to go in and then to link up with the unit that was operating a few kilometers away from us. So I moved to my spot and I crossed this road. It was dark. There was not a moon out that I could remember. It was North Carolina, and I believe it was cloudy, but there was visibility, as there always is. It's just that the visibility was not that great. Now, as I was sitting there, I was laying in a prone position, looking up and down the road, making sure that if anybody came in, I would not only be unseen, but that I would be able to see whoever came down that road first. Well, as I was sitting there, I began to hear a loud female scream. And it was not far away, but it wasn't very near. I would say it was maybe within 100 yards of me, and it wasn't anything close enough to cause me to have any concern. Now, it wasn't that I wasn't concerned because I had a loaded weapon. I didn't. The weapons we had all had blanks in them, and we were not allowed, of course, to practice with live ammunition when we were training. So my only weapon was a K-bar that I always carried, and I guess the butt of my M16. So as I'm waiting for the rest of the patrol to come up, the scream, which I heard the first time, didn't really happen again for some time, so I just wrote it off. But then it happened again, and this time it had closed the distance to about half. And it was a terrifying scream, because I can tell the sound of any animal. You can tell the sound of an animal because they vocalize in certain ways. But this was something that I had never heard before because it sounded exactly like a woman. And I knew that I was in the middle of a training area on Fort Bragg. There could not possibly be a woman screaming. So I said that must be some kind of an animal that I don't know about that lives in North Carolina. And so I sat there and just dismissing it as maybe a wildcat. I knew there was nothing in that area that could injure me. So I just sat there and listened and was just a little bit more concerned than I had been at first. But the scream got closer, and it had again halved the distance between myself and it was coming out towards the road. It had been behind me for the whole time, but now it was actually coming out toward the road. And I could not see it. I was laying in the prone, I was lying on my stomach, and I had my weapon in front of me, and I was looking down to the area where I knew that this thing would walk out onto the road. I just waited, but nothing happened. And then I thought, well, it might be sneaking up on me. So I stood up and I started to move. And as I started to move to get away from it, to put some distance between myself and it screamed again, and again it had gotten closer. And the vegetation that I was in, it was near a road, but there were trees right bordering the road about maybe 20 yards in. And the scream came from the trees. It was at that point I said, that's just too much. And I began walking back across the road in the direction of the rest of my patrol. And I just happened to stumble into them as soon as I got across the road. And they asked me if everything was okay. I said, no problem. And I never, ever mentioned this to anybody until now. But as I hear these stories of encounters with Sasquatch and Bigfoot and hairy man and whatever man these people are down in the South, of course, like most people, I would not suspect that one of these things would be like a Bigfoot creature, because I would have left those behind in Washington State. But maybe this isn't the case. Whatever that thing got very close to me that night, and so far nobody's ever been able to explain what that actually was until I started listening to people's Bigfoot encounters. The next two stories are about the paranormal. The first story I'm going to tell you happened to me, and it happened after I graduated from college. I graduated from Washington State University, and the year following my graduation, I thought it would be fun, as there was a local bar and dance joint that was sitting basically unopened. And I went to the owner with some friends of mine and proposed that we open the bar and the dance club and get it going again. Well, he wanted to make money off of that, so he was all for that. So I became the manager of Rusty's Bar. Now, what I didn't know about Rusty's Bar, I'm going to tell you in a little bit, but it is going to be a little bit unsettling. So I want to tell you this before we get too far into the story, in case you want to skip ahead or turn it off. Now, one night when I was finished, the bar was closed. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was just sitting. There was a dance floor, and we had those old video players or whatever, where they had the multicolor lights that shone onto a screen, and that was like the dance screen, whatever. And I was just sitting watching, and it was an REM video, and I was alone in the bar, and the bar is not very big. It's about as big as a classroom, a normal classroom. It's not a very big bar, and it's all made of wood, and it has this dance area, and I was basically standing on one side, just watching this video and getting ready to close. And as I'm standing there watching it with my face or my back to the majority of the bar, something comes and whispers, blows right into my ear. And my first, I thought it was somebody playing a joke. Somebody had stayed behind. They'd maybe been in the bathroom or something, and they had come up to scare me. So I turned around and said, what the, you know what is, who is that? You know, I was so surprised, and I didn't know. I was just waiting to see who would do, you know, this kind of thing to a person because the only light in the place is coming basically from the screen, and there's some backlights from the beer signs behind the bar. So it's very dimly lit, and I was turning around to see who was there, and there wasn't a person there. Nobody. And I didn't know what to do. I ran. I knew that the front door was locked, and I left the till, I left the lights on, and I ran out the back door. And I went home. Now, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is I went to the owner's secretary, and he had a couple of businesses in the town, and I told her that something weird had happened in that bar, and I didn't feel comfortable being in there alone. And she said, didn't anybody ever tell you the bar is haunted? Like I should have known that. Like it was on the, the job description. So I talked to her for a second about that and was a little bit disconcerted. And then I went and hunted down the local beer distributor who had also managed the bar a few years prior. And I just asked him, I said, has anything weird ever happened here? He says, yeah. He says, it's haunted. He said, Rusty, who the bar is named after, died of a heart attack in his office. And he never left. And so that is the story of Rusty's Bar. Now, the last story I'm going to tell you is a story that also happened to me, but happened to a friend of mine, two friends of mine, two very good friends of mine. And there's an unfortunate situation here where one of my friends, while we were in high school, took his own life. And this story picks up 30 years later, and it happened again after I had finished college. I had finished working at the bar where something odd had happened, and I decided I wanted to get back into teaching or get into teaching, and I needed to get my master's degree. So things were happening around my life, and I thought the best thing to do was to go to Alaska and get my master's degree there. Now, when I arrived in Alaska, I knew there were a couple of friends of mine from my hometown that lived there, and I figured, well, they can help me, getting set up and everything. And I contacted one, and he said, yeah, there's been a horrible accident. He said that our friend, I'll call him Claude, our friend Claude was hit by a dump truck full of snow in his truck, which was a fairly substantial truck, but there had been an ammo can, which they used for storing bullets, in his truck that he used for a toolbox. And that can had basically ended up hitting him in the head and literally crushing the side of his head. And so when I got there, he was unconscious. And so for a few days, we would go back and we would see him, and slowly he was starting to recover. Now, as he began to recover, every day when I would go to see him, he would say, "Oh, Matt, you're in Alaska. Oh, that's great. It's good you're up here. You're going to love it. I love it. I never want to leave here." And he'd tell me how great Alaska was. Now, every time I would see him, he would tell me how great Alaska was and how he couldn't believe I was there. And it was as if he was seeing me for the first time. And this happened for weeks. So I began to get used to him thinking that I had just gotten to Alaska and this is the first time I'd seen him. And so he was going to tell me the same stories. Now, one of the stories that he told me was about when he basically blacked out and they had written him off and said that he was no longer with us and that he was clinically dead. And he was gone for some time. I think at least 10 or 15 minutes. And during that time that he was gone, he saw our friend who took his own life when we were in high school. Now, every day I went to see him, he could not remember seeing me the day before. But every day I went to see him, he told me that he played golf with this friend of mine in heaven. And he said that according to the story, and I heard this story every day, that this friend of ours who golfed with my friend Claude, he told him that he knew he liked Alaska and that he wasn't going to be able to stay in heaven. He'd come later. And he said that heaven was great and it was really fun to be there. And you just couldn't imagine what a fantastic place it was. And every time I went to see this friend of mine, he would tell me the same story. And it took months before I finally said, I've heard that story before. But even now, that is one of after the serious brain damage, that is the one thing that he can remember from his life or anything more vividly than anything else, was this encounter with our long since passed away friend. So that is my last story, and the last story of Northwest Paranormal. So if you have any stories like this, or any stories that you would like to share, please contact me. We can write a book, and if I get enough of them, we can just go ahead and we can make our own podcast, because I think there's definitely enough material out there when you talk about your Sasquatch, your extraterrestrials, your UFOs, and your paranormal and ghost sightings out here just in Washington State. Especially you Native Americans that listen to this podcast, I know you have a lot of stories. So we'd sure like to hear them, and we'd like to have you share them with us. And also, we'd like to compile them into a book. All right, so I just want to say that I really have enjoyed doing this podcast. It's very difficult when you get some guests that they don't meet their obligations or whatever, and you just don't know, is this for something, is this a personal reason, or is this something that maybe they don't like the podcast and in any way. So it's kind of unsettling there, but I've had such great guests, and I have such great guests that are coming. So I know this podcast is going to really take off, and it's really going to take off very soon. And so if you're listening and you're an author and you'd like to be on the podcast, contact me at greatbooks@heinessight.com. And if you have any questions, comments, whatever, please leave them in the comment section, and please subscribe. And I guess that we'll have I don't know what the time is. I didn't see when I started, but we'll just have this kind of a shorter, more fun podcast today. And tomorrow I'm going to have John DeGraff, who's the author of the best-selling book Affluenza, and he goes all over the world to talk about how the United States consumerism is basically eating up the environment and causing the rest of the world to start this chase of a dog chasing its tail like we do, that is not going to work very well when you have billions of people wanting to have all of the things that we enjoy in America. So it's going to be a great podcast, and we can't wait to get John on here. And we just have to say that when we close this paranormal and kind of scary podcast, we hope our author, V.G. Anderson, is out there somewhere, and we hope that her and her husband are okay, and our prayers are with you, and we want to get you back to the podcast if you want to be back on the podcast, and if not, that's fine too. But we just hope that you and your husband are out okay in your travels. We know the weather is really rough out there, and a lot of people are in bad situations and bad circumstances. So let's hope that's not happening to you. And for everybody else out there, I just want to encourage you to look at Heinessight.com, look at booksinhindsight.com, get yourself a couple of books, and please keep on reading.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Heinz. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to theheinesight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Heinz and other great authors.